A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's, in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth. Read by Sarah D. Chapter 15. I was very tired during the next few days. My body had grown used to doing so little work during my 2 months' holiday. Now the 6 o'clock rising and the long hours spent on my feet had taken it by surprise. As soon as I arrived home, a sort of lassitude would overcome me. At the same time, I was nervy and irritable. "You're driving me mad," Stephen exploded at me one evening. I looked at him without much surprise. "Why, this time?" "I don't know. You sit there and you sit there and you keep on sitting. All the time I'm willing you to say something or do something, but you just sit there. You don't notice anything." "I'm sorry. I'm tired." "I know you are," grudgingly. "But I can't understand. How can you be happy just not doing anything? Don't you want to live, experience things? Haven't you got some aim in life? Something you want badly? I feel as if you're quite content doing the same things over and over. Doesn't the thought of it make you depressed? You're in a dead end and you seem to like it." He glared at me defiantly. "Well, I've got a new job, a career, really, and I've only recently got you." "Yes, but, oh, there's something missing somewhere. You know what I am? Lonely." He flung it at me. "You make me lonely." "Why? I'm not stopping you from seeing your friends, or am I?" I asked him. "No, my friends are broad-minded. It isn't that. I just feel lonely when I'm with you, when I should feel completed and fulfilled." His voice rose with emotion, and he coughed with irritation at himself. "If you'd just talk," he went on more slowly, "instead of sitting there so drearily." "Well, why don't you start a conversation if it worries you?" "I don't know. After a while I get beyond it, sort of hypnotized by your silence. It's awful. It has to be you that starts talking. Don't look at me like that. What is it? You think I'm theatrical, don't you? I can tell." This was exactly what I was thinking, and I tried hurriedly to summon up a reply. Instead, I said, "You don't seem to like me very much." "Maybe I don't like you much tonight, but I still love you, unfortunately. I never wanted to, and I didn't know how right I was. I love you, and I'm lonely, and I can't buy any cigarettes." "Why not?" I was bewildered. "I can't afford it," he told me grudgingly. "Well, is that my fault? I'm getting my wages and paying my share of the rent and stuff." "I didn't have to pay rent at home," he reminded me, "not to mention extra for bus fares." "All right, go home." I felt my body stiffen. "Don't be silly, Di. Come here. You know what's really the matter?" He was smiling now. "I just realized it in school the other day. It's been getting me down." "What?" "I love you so much. I keep on telling you, and you've never told me. If you do—" His voice had become jerky and urgent. "Haven't I?" I tried to sound surprised. "No, never, never, never." His tone suddenly hardened, and he seemed to tense himself. I knew he was waiting for my reply, and I made a desperate effort. "Stephen, I do. I'm almost sure. I'm just scared to say it, because I was wrong once." It sounded trite to me, but Stephen relaxed against me and claimed my mouth in a grateful kiss. "Darling, you're so sweet. Are you too tired to come to bed?" I had been working at the hospital for about 10 days when I found myself suddenly transferred to another ward. "It's only temporary," Sister told me. "The regular nurses are off ill. Nurse Brooks will take you." Ward 11 was an old ladies' ward. It smelt. It smelt of warm, sour urine and dysentery and perspiration. The old women were clad clumsily in patched flannel dresses, wrinkled stockings, and flowered pinafores. Some of them were in wheelchairs, misshapen or legless. The others just sat around, muttering and singing. I love London town, an old woman was croaking, rocking her stool backwards and forwards. Shut up, shouted an ugly woman with one long tooth. You bitch, you filthy bloody bitch. I turned to Nurse Brooks, but she was hurrying over to the other side of the room. Now, Martha, she said coaxingly. The woman had a pair of thick brown bloomers pulled over her head. She's always doing that, she explained, tugging them off. You can do without now, you silly girl. They're wet anyway. I noticed pools of urine under several of the old women's chairs. Yes, I better clean those up, Nurse Brooks nodded. If you'd be sewing buttons on that pile of frocks over there, it doesn't matter about the colours. I went and sat at the bench where several old women were playing with the buttons. Nurse, nurse, I want to tell you about our Charlie, a woman called out to me, coming across the room. Her Charlie, the long-toothed woman said contemptuously. Yes, our Charlie. He'll be home soon. What's the time? She tripped and fell, bumping her head. I lifted her, repelled by the feel of her body under the warm flannel dress. That this should be a living person, living flesh, on a mind that was quickly dying, filled me with horror. She sat beside me as I picked up a frock and began to sew. Her hand was raised to her head in a puzzled way, but she went on earnestly. Ah, Charlie's coming home. You remember him. He helped you in with the cuckoo clock. Well, what's the time? What's the time? A grey hand clawed at me, and I looked down to see a tiny, thin woman with a childish face and white hair. She was running her hands through this hair, showing a bony pink scalp. There's glass in it, she told me nervously, and stuttered for a few seconds before going on. It's all in my hair. Where are the scissors, nurse? I'll have to cut it. Where are they? There are no scissors, I said firmly, feeling the handle of those in my back pocket as I sat against them. And there's no glass either, dear. She muttered to herself for a few minutes, and I caught the word lavatory. Do you want to go to the lavatory? Come on, then. This ward was laid out in almost exactly the same way as Ward 1, so I found the toilet with no trouble. There. I arranged her on the seat and stood with the half-door open, waiting. She had had no underclothes on whatsoever. Her stockings were round her stick-like ankles. Her body had been light as matchwood. She went on muttering at a fearful speed as I shepherded her back to the sitting-room. Her milky eyes were imploring, and her thin hands flickered in and out of her hair. There's glass in it, nurse. You see? It was the party, all in the marquee, and my sister was lying down upstairs, had to see, and then there was glass in my hair, glass in my sister's hair, older than me. Nellie isn't coming here, is she? Want to go to the lavatory? Come on, dear, you've been to the lavatory. I sat her at the table, and she went on talking to her neighbour. Nurse Brooks was attending to the woman who had bumped her head. She's fallen down again, and she's bleeding now. She's a cheerful old thing, but she won't sit still. There. No, stay there. She turned to me. We'll have to get the tables out for their tea now. Could you be buttering bread? It's sliced in the kitchen. I've got the kettles on. I went into the dark room and began buttering the thick bread in desperate haste, listening to Nurse Brooks clattering the chairs and tables beyond the open hatch. My hands were shaking as I piled the slices onto the plates and tipped jam into the dishes. There's cake too, Nurse Brooks called. Don't put it all out, about half. I found the crumbly yellow cake in the cupboard and added it to the trays. The women were chattering excitedly, making their clumsy way to the tables. I moved round quickly with the heavy teapot as they called out impatiently. Nurse, I haven't had any bread yet. A short woman, thick as a tree trunk, and with a smooth, high forehead, turned worried eyes on me. Well, there you are, then. I spread her some jam hurriedly and moved on. The others were helping themselves greedily, then dropping what they were eating absent-mindedly on the floor like children. Nurse, I haven't had anything, an earnest voice pulled me round. It was the same woman with the high forehead, and her eyes looked at me, hurt and reproachful. Yes, you threw it on the floor, I told her, and tipped another slice onto her plate. No, I didn't, nurse. I haven't had anything. I was feeding the baby. I'm married, you see. I'm married, aren't I? She showed me a piece of blue wool tied round her finger. Yes, dear, I soothed. Well, eat your bread now. A staff nurse arrived soon after this and helped us clear away the mess. You two go to tea now, she told us. It's 4:15. Better wash your hands in Dettol. Nurse Brooks led me out to the cloakroom. We've got dysentery here. That's why the regular nurses are off. How do you like it? Bit different from one, isn't it? It certainly is. I used to be on here last year. I'm on 5 now. That's not so bad. This is one of the worst ones. The more normal atmosphere of the canteen was a relief. It smelt of warm bread and buttered crumpets. Nurse Brooks piled her tray high with brown bread and crumpets and 2 little dishes of jam. You're not eating much, she looked at me. You've got to go till 9. Yes, I'm not very hungry. I was feeling a bit sick. I've got a lecture after this, she told me, eating quickly. Staff will stay on with you till 5:30. I'll be back by then. I managed to find my way back to the ward without much trouble. A pair of worried eyes were staring at me through the glass. The old woman watched anxiously as I unlocked the heavy door and relocked it behind me. I found my hands fumbling as I did so, and they shook as I slid the big key into my back pocket. Come on, I coaxed her. You don't want to go out there. It's cold out there, was all I could think of to say. She stared blankly and didn't move, so I began to walk on down the passage. An excited muttering made me turn around again. She had the door open. I dived back and closed it. I hadn't locked it properly. I was flushed and my heart was beating disturbingly. You don't want to go out there, I repeated, taking her flabby hand. What's out there? Everything. She looked back and whimpered. We began to put them to bed at 7:30. It takes ages, Nurse Brooke told me, pulling a face. Look, run and take the temperatures, etc., of the old dears in bed while I get the commodes ready. You might have to fight with that end one. She wasn't the only one I had to fight with. We wheeled in the crippled ones first and sat them on the commode while we tugged their stale-smelling clothes over their heads. I tried not to look at the short stumps of the crooked little woman I was undressing, but she shrieked at me, They got my legs! Look, they got my legs! I'll get all their bloody legs, won't I? Bloody legs! At the same time, one of the women who had been in bed got up and began charging round the room with her head down, butting the air. Goo, 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 goo! That's Fanny, Nurse Brooks told me calmly. We'll get her back in bed later. She goes on like that all the time. She's quite young, too. She was in Ward 1 at one stage, having electric treatment. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? That's right. Tie their clothes up in their stockings if they haven't messed them. We had wheeled the commodes down to those patients confined to bed with dysentery, and were changing the filthy sheets, when one of the women, with a pointed impish face, started talking to us. Have you got a boy, nurse, have you? She asked us. Are you married? The night we got married now, oh, that was something. He wouldn't put the light out, my husband, and there it was, big as that. I didn't half get a shock, and he was so impatient. That's all you're getting for tonight, my girl, he said, 'cause you're too small. Nurse Brooks laughed heartily. She's a sexy old piece, isn't she? See your eyes sparkle. The woman looked delighted. Yes, that's what he said. You're too small. Oh, I was too. 'Twasn't half messy. Oh, it is awful. Don't you get married, nurse. Help. Better get this away. The almoner'll be round. Nurse Brooks began to trundle the commode up the ward, while I folded the screen up. I tried to stop my hands shaking as I dipped them in the Dettol bucket, but it only made my muscles ache, so I gave up and dried my hands jerkily. I wouldn't like to be on night duty here, I said to Nurse Brooks as we waited for the clock to move round. Why not? She asked. There's nothing much to do, and there's a fire. They don't go having fits and things like Ward 5. Stephen looked at me in amazement as I came in the door of our room. What's the matter? Nothing. I was on a different ward. You look funny. He put his arms around me. What are you so cold for? Darling, was it awful? Oh, darling, I began, and then looked away, confused. Stephen grinned at me triumphantly. Well, go on. I don't expect you will. Yes, I will. Oh, Stephen, I want to tell you about it. Let's sit down and I'll tell you about it. Aren't you hungry? No, I feel so sick. My voice spilled out of me and I went on, talking about the grotesque old women, while Stephen listened silently, watching me curiously. I hadn't locked it properly, and I said, "You don't want to go out? What's out there?" And she said, "Everything." My voice grew shakier as I spoke, and I kept feeling an urge to laugh hysterically. "For God's sake, you have changed." I noticed I was chewing the polish on my fingernail and thrust it away from me impatiently. "Darling." He stroked my hair. For once he seemed at a loss for something to say. "Oh, darling," I said for the second time, "I'm so frightened." "What of?" "Just of being alive. Do I have to go back to that place? You do think it's awful, don't you? All that stuff I told you?" "It sounds just horrible." "Well, thank God for that." I relaxed suddenly, and before long fell asleep. Chapter 16. Within a few days I was back on Ward 1. After the old ladies' ward, it seemed dazzlingly clean and efficiently run. There were several new patients, all of them bedridden, some with varicose veins, one with an injured back, which meant more bedpans and more work generally. I was finding it harder and harder to get up in the mornings. Stephen would lie in bed, watching me with half an eye, while I fastened my apron with frantic fingers. Soon after this, I missed the morning bus and the coach which connected with it. I was in the cloakroom pinning my cap when Sister came by and looked in. "Oh, so there you are," she watched me sarcastically. With the others she got on well, chaffing and teasing them in a friendly way, but my quietness and anxiety to please prompted her to be scornful and irritable with me. If I tried to make a joke of something, she would raise her eyebrows in silent surprise, then look as if she hadn't heard. I listened to her lecture in silence, then raised my eyes to meet her gaze. "Well, you better get on and help staff. It's ECT today. I don't know why you have to live out anyway," she added, as if to herself. "Yes, sister." I hurried to the ward and grasped a heavy floor polisher. "We've done that, Nurse Clouston," the staff nurse called out. "You could sweep the veranda and see how Miss Dear is while you're there. She's had insulin." The sun was shining timidly in the chilly glass veranda, and specks of dust shone, suspended in it. Miss Dear was lying with her arms flung out across the bed, shivering violently. A sickly smell of perspiration hung about her. "Are you all right, Miss Dear?" I asked her as I bent down to sweep under her bed. "Yes, thank you, nurse. I haven't had my glucose yet." "Oh, you'll get that about 9 o'clock, I told her. "Thank you, nurse." Suddenly the glass doors rattled, and Nurse O'Brien appeared on the step. "Doctor's here," she called out. "Could you get the stretcher ready while we do the beds?" The beds in one half of the ward were pushed together so as to prevent the patients from falling onto the floor during the artificial fit which the electric treatment produced. Nurse O'Brien and I waited at the doctor's door. At length it opened, and the familiar stertorous breathing reached us as a patient was wheeled out. Together we hoisted the woman onto the bed, and I waited beside her until the jerking limbs began to relax. Then I drew the breathing apparatus from her mouth and covered her with the red blanket. She had bitten her lip, and a little blood oozed down her chin to mingle with the froth. "Not so many today," Nurse O'Brien called as the beds began to fill up. "You can start getting the end ones up now. Damn, there's no name on this mug. Do you know who these teeth belong to?" "I think they're Miss Charles's," I volunteered. "Oh, yes, that's right. These'll be her slippers, too." I was helping one of the patients out to the sitting room when she looked up at me. "When am I going to have the shock treatment, nurse?" She leaned shakily on my arm. "You've had it, dear." "No, I haven't." She looked bewildered. "Yes, it's all over," I smiled at her. "But I don't remember." "Of course you don't remember." I lowered her into an armchair and signed to one of the other patients to fetch her a cup of tea. Sister's quick footsteps sounded behind me. "Hurry up with that, Nurse Clouston. I want you to screen Mrs. Lang and Miss Druid. Dr. Rhodes is coming in to examine them." "Who—" I began. "The ones with cradles on their legs," Sister added impatiently. "And I want you to take Mrs. Moody to the dentist, and drop this file into the main office as you come back." I was returning past the sterilizing room when Sister darted out and grabbed my arm. "Nurse Clouston, I want you to wash down the lockers. Take them out to the cloakroom to do them, not the ones of the patients in bed, of course." Nurse O'Brien was passing and raised her eyebrows at me over Sister's shoulder. I had lugged the last of the heavy lockers back to the ward and was busy washing down the bed of a patient who had moved to another ward when Nurse O'Brien came over, clasping a stone hot water bottle. "Sister's got a down on you today," she said. "You haven't had any tea yet, have you?" "No." I felt suddenly sorry for myself. "Look, take this out to the kitchen as if you're going to fill it, and get yourself a cup. I'll do this." She held out the hot water bottle. But at that moment, Sister's voice was raised in the sterilizing room. "Nurse Clouston, come here." Trembling like a schoolgirl, I hurried to her. "Is this your Dettol water? Then what's it doing here, for goodness sake? Who do you expect to clear it away if you don't? You'll have to pull your socks up, my girl. And while we're on the subject," she added, "haven't you got any better stockings than those? You're earning enough here to afford a pair of black stockings once in a while." I felt my mouth tugging at the corners in an urgent desire to cry. I was afraid to open it. Instead, I looked at my feet. The stockings had laddered at the toe, and the ladders had crept up over my feet. My suede shoes were covered with dust collected while I swept out the veranda. The sight disgusted me, but at the same time I felt unjustly insulted. "Yes, and you'll have to get some other shoes," Sister went on, "or at least some rubber soles. Those are disturbing the patients." I returned to the ward and silently continued scrubbing down the bed. Nurse O'Brien started on the other side with a second cloth. "You're on a long day, aren't you?" she asked after some time. I nodded. "Well, at least you'll get off at 12:15 for lunch. I've got to put up with her till 2. She's terrible today." At 12:15 I hurried towards the canteen, buttoning my cuffs with trembling fingers. My hands still shook as I bore my tray with stew and apple pie to an empty table. I had forgotten to collect a coffee spoon, so stirred in the sugar with my dessert spoon. The atmosphere of the canteen was beginning to give me a sense of temporary security. Was security always to be merely temporary for me? I thought of how I would tell Stephen of Sister's lecturing me, and tears of self-pity came to my eyes. The green sugar dispenser wobbled and steadied as tears kept threatening. I began hurriedly to eat and felt better with each warm, tasteless mouthful. I was raising my cup to my lips when the assistant matron came in, and I held it there, watching her absently over the rim while she selected a table. Suddenly, I noticed my teeth were rattling on the side of the cup. I lowered it quickly, staring at it in horror. It reminded me of a comedy situation in a film, the kind of thing that would happen in a comic strip. And yet this was no comedy. It was real, and this was me it was happening to. These were my teeth rattling on the cup. A sudden hysteria overtook me. I would have to laugh or cry. Then the clock on the wall luckily drew my attention. I couldn't afford to be late a second time. Discarding my apple pie, I returned to the ward. In the afternoon, a different sister was on duty, a gentle, smiling creature, and I sighed with relief. It was visiting day, and instead of having to stand with our hands clasped behind our backs, Nurse O'Rourke and I were permitted to sit at a table at one end of the ward, making swabs. I was so relieved to be off my feet at last that I found myself slouching carelessly in the hard chair. I was curious to see what kind of visitors each patient had, so watched the coated figures, which seemed so out of place in the ward, with half my attention. Nurse O'Rourke was chattering on about her boy. "We're getting engaged tomorrow," she told me with a sudden casualness. "'Cause that's my birthday. You wouldn't like to swap your day off, would you? It doesn't matter if you don't want to." "No, that's all right. When's yours?" "Wednesday. Only another day away, and you'd be on afternoons tomorrow." "Oh, good, as long as I don't have to get up early." "Do you like afternoons best, then?" She looked surprised. "Gosh, I think they're boring. But thanks, anyway." It was after tea, when I was clearing the flowers from the ward, when Mrs. Baird, the alcoholic, spoke to me in her deadpan voice. "Hello, Nurse Clouston. You were on this morning, weren't you?" "Yes, I'm on a long day today." "Oh, I see. I've got a sweet for you, nurse. Help yourself in that drawer." I was moving off with her vase of flowers when a choking sound pulled me round again. One of the woman's arms was flailing uncontrolled above her head, while her face was turning an odd grey colour. I ran hastily for Sister and bumped into Dr. Bryant, leaving his room. He hurried ahead of me down the ward, adding over his shoulder as he saw Mrs. Baird's face, "Better fetch the oxygen." I trundled the clumsy apparatus across the floor with noisy speed and stood aside, clasping my hands together to steady myself. "I think she'll be all right now." Dr. Bryant straightened up at last. "Where did Sister get to, anyway?" "I don't know." "Well, when the other nurse comes back from her lecture, one of you'd better get some oxygen. That thing was nearly empty." I straightened the screens round her bed, then stood by hesitantly, wondering whether to go on clearing the flowers. A sound of vomiting sent me running for a kidney bowl. As I took it away from under her flabby chin, Mrs. Baird raised unseeing eyes to me. They watched me dazedly as I covered the bowl, then all at once seemed to click into focus, and she cried out, "Something's happened! What is it, nurse? What's happened?" "You're all right now," I tried to reassure her. "Something must have gone wrong. What is it? I'm frightened." These last words suddenly made me aware that Mrs. Baird was not merely another patient, to be panned and blanket-bathed at regular intervals. She was a person, like myself, and she was frightened. I tried to smile at her confidently, then I let out my breath with shaky relief as I saw Sister approaching down the ward. I missed the 9 o'clock coach that evening and had to walk down the eerily shadowed steps. The room was in darkness when I got home. I switched on the light and Stephen sat up in bed. "Good heavens, it's only 10:15. I looked at him in amazement. "I was tired," he told me. "I never get to sleep again after you leave in the mornings." "You're lucky you can lie in at all." "Are you in a bad mood?" "No." "Well, hurry up and come to bed if you're coming." "I'm going to have something to eat first." "I'll go to sleep," he threatened. "Go to sleep then. I'm hungry." "Oh, all right." He turned away from me. I opened the cupboard door angrily and cut myself a piece of cheese. It tasted stale, so I threw the remainder into the rubbish bin. "What are you doing?" he asked as I sat on the bed to roll my stockings off. "I'm coming to bed." "Oh, all right then." I pulled the blankets up under my armpits and lay stiffly on my side of the bed. Gradually, Stephen's breathing grew heavy and regular. I shuffled in the bed and sighed exaggeratedly, but he didn't stir. Hot tears swelled under my wide-open lids. I muttered, "Oh," impatiently, and he half sat up. "What's the matter?" "Nothing." "Then go to sleep. Aren't you tired?" "Yes, tireder than you," I flung at him. He had turned back to the wall and before long was breathing heavily again. I sighed loudly, then climbed out of bed, snatching the eiderdown, which I took with me to the sofa. Huddled in a ball, I began to cry, quietly at first, then more fiercely until I was gulping and almost choking. When I had managed to get my breath back, I sat up suddenly and shouted at Stephen, "Wake up!" "I'm awake. What the hell's the matter with you?" "Don't you know?" "No, I don't. For God's sake, come to bed and don't be so silly." "No, I hate you. I don't want to touch you." "What?" He bounced out of bed and came over. "I don't want to touch you," I repeated more quietly. "I'll sleep here." "You're coming to bed," he said through his teeth, and suddenly he had lifted and deposited me there. I tried to sit up, but he was hitting me angrily, so that I fell first to one side, then the other. Then he made love to me with a sudden unaccustomed violence. "You hit me!" I was still crying. "You kept on hitting me." "Of course I did. Are you all right now?" he added after a pause. "Yes, it was just that you wouldn't talk. I wanted to talk." I was exhausted. "We'll talk tomorrow. Sleep now," he told me. "Go to sleep." And before long, I was sleeping.